morning. I'm Gary Sutton. This is the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. It's Martin Luther King Day. It all started back in 1986 to honor a great leader in this country.
I have a dream. My 4 little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
That was the speech in 1963 in Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. And if you've ever studied the speech, there was an awful lot of that just went off the cuff at the end. And Martin Luther King, probably, in my opinion, the greatest speech I ever heard. With us this morning is a very special guest, Bishop Counsel Nedd. He is the Right Reverend Counsel, is a founding member of the Project 21 Black Leadership Network. He also serves as director at St. Albans Anglican Church in Pine Grove Mills, Pennsylvania, is a third presiding bishop of the Episcopal Missionary Church, and he's also the author of the book, The Final Four, A Scriptural Journey Through Advent. And we welcome Bishop Counsel Nedd back to the Gary Sutton Show. Bishop Nedd, great to have you aboard this morning.
It's great to be on again.
Thank you. Bishop Nedd, your thoughts when you hear that cut, and, you know, it's so familiar to us now, and yet it always resonates with me. I find the hair standing up the back of my neck because it always rings true to me what Martin Luther King Jr. had to say so many years ago.
Well, it's amazing. That speech is amazing on so many levels. It just stands on its own. But the fact that he wasn't even going to tell that story on that day,
that's right,
that was sort of amazing also. But, you know, it does ring true and it does resonate. And here we are however many years later, and, you know, for the most part, the dream of Dr. King was realized. If you think about the world in which he lived, it's a radically different America than the one that he lived and grew up in and died in. And, I guess the America that, the society that ultimately caused his death, I suppose. If you think back, there were riots in the street of America over issues of race and equality.
Yes.
People were dying and being beaten in the streets, and we live in a radically different place. You turn on the news today, there are riots in Ukraine this morning. We don't have that in this country.
Right.
His dream has essentially been realized.
When you look at the issues today, we were just talking about one that happened in Pennsylvania on Friday, and I had called the NAACP to have a guest on, and they were not able to supply one today. But they were in favor of Judge McGinley's ruling on Friday that said, well, you don't have to have an ID in this country. And I was talking this morning. I was a history teacher for 25 years before I got into this stuff, and basically remember the days when I was a kid of going through the South. There were poll taxes then. There were literacy tests. There were separate kinds of things that you had to do to be a voter if you were of color at that time than if you weren't. And on Friday, the idea of a voter ID was knocked down by Judge McGinley, and then people came out and said, well, that's great because people were trying to cheat. They were trying to do something to us. Well, but if everybody in the country has to do it, I couldn't really understand that. I wonder what your thoughts were on that this morning, and maybe even be so bold as to ask what Dr. King might have thought about something like that.
Hundreds and thousands of black Americans lived and fought and died for the right to vote. Now, for the government to say that, we don't really need to protect this, the integrity of this process, and you don't really need to prove who you are is absurd. Either it's going to be a protected process and the integrity of the election is going to be upheld, or it's not. And for, the government to say, well, you know what, it's not so important, it's an insult, it's a slap in the face.
I was reading an article this morning that talked about all the various Martin Luther King boulevards that we have in this country, and I was reading this piece out of St. Louis, and it said a walk down the 6-mile city street named the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard yields plenty of images that would surely unsettle the civil rights leader. Shuttered storefronts, open-air drug markets, a glut of pawn shops, quickie check-cashing providers, liquor stores. The urban decay along Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in St. Louis can be found in other major American cities, from Houston and Milwaukee to the nation's capital. On these boulevards that are named after this great man who was advocating the idea of equality and, recognizing someone based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, why are we still at that point in a lot of these cities today, Bishop?
There are lots of reasons. I think there's a huge amount of apathy on a part of people. I think you've got politicians who are more focused on political expediency than true leadership. They're more interested in political pandering, telling people what they want to hear and not actually doing anything about it. And, there's a malaise that I guess comes over a lot of people as well. There are numerous reasons, but, here we are now in 2014. Barack Obama's the president. We have a black president. You would think he would be doing more to inspire the black community, but no, he's doing the exact opposite. He's pandering on issues of race, and I think he's perpetuating some of the worst stereotypes and setting up a scenario where he comes across as a martyr without actually doing anything to help people. I mean, look at his hometown of Chicago and the mess that's going on there. He's done absolutely nothing about it, show no leadership, and just plays political games.
Let me ask you a question. You're a black man.
Yes.
Have you ever thought about being a black man as you've come up through? I know you also were involved at one point in time in being a congressional aide. You were in politics a little bit. You kind of got away from that and came into something I know you've really loved, according to everything I've read. But tell us about growing up as a black man. If you considered it that way, where you consider it and where you don't, and how you move forward and how you become successful.
Well, my father was from a different era. Most of my friends' dads fought in Vietnam. My dad fought in World War II. So he was a lot older.
Right.
He was a policeman, and my mother worked for the federal government. And he was very big into do hard work, and you'll be rewarded for it.
Okay.
And he was also very big on the idea of, if you want something, you're going to need to do it yourself because nobody's going to do it for you. That's just the era that he grew up in. And so, that's what I grew up hearing. And so, I set various goals for myself at different points and just went after them. Sometimes I failed, sometimes I succeeded, but I didn't expect anybody to do it for me, and I think that's the difference. Now you've got people that have grown up knowing nothing other than the government provides this, the government provides housing, the government provides food, the government provides this. And I think that's the difference.
Dr. King fought for black people to have the same access to jobs, the same access to opportunities in this country, rightfully so. He stood tall against that. He went to jail for it. He conducted demonstrations for it. I mean, it was a forming time here for our country during the 50s and 60s. Did you ever come across race as you're coming forward in your life? Did you ever come across it? How did you deal with it during that time when people said somehow, or they were trying in some way, subtly or overtly, to say, well, you can't have this because you're black?
It wasn't so much that. I've experienced some racism, because, again, I was born in 1968, so,
right.
There were a couple little kids I remember that, I can't play with you because you're black. You're lost.
Yeah.
Fine. Everybody else will all go play over here then, and you can play by yourself. I've experienced it, but, the fact is, there are ignorant people in every segment of society. Exactly. Wherever you go. Yeah. They're black racists, they're white racists, and, there's a whole spectrum of people. The point is, you shouldn't let anybody deter you from what you're planning to do with your life. And you certainly shouldn't make these ignorant people excuses for your own failures.
One of the biggest things that we see today, and President Obama dealing with this idea, and I've complained about this a lot for any people of any color, it doesn't matter, because I think we're not dealing enough with Americans and with citizens today. We're dealing more with kind of keeping us divided, and race happens to be one of the ways I think some of the people like Al Sharpton and unfortunately even Jesse Jackson are doing that. And I guess my point that I'm trying to get to is it seems to me that we ought to be doing everything we can in this country to make every citizen, no matter who they are, independent, more independent, to the extent that we can, and where we cannot do it ourselves, then that's where the government should help out. Instead, you mentioned about people who are born who, are living off the government. And I've talked to people who say generationally that's what they understand. They grew up doing that, just like you grew up doing independent stuff. How do we get at that problem?
I think more than at any other point in American society, people should realize that, the government's not the savior. The government's not necessarily here to help. The government exists to protect its own interests, it seems, at this point, and more so than at any other point in the history of our country. And what are you going to do when the government performs some huge, open, overt betrayal and attacks our rights and attacks our civil liberties? What are you going to do then? People more than ever now need to, one, I think, rely on God, but then also, start preparing for the worst, doing whatever you can to sort of help lift yourself up out of your condition. I think it's just time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm looking at Martin Luther King back in the 60s, and a lot of people think that John Kennedy and company were in favor of civil rights during that time, and they weren't. And here was Dr. King talking about when John Kennedy, the president, got involved with his life and his movement. Let's listen a little bit.
The Kennedy family did have some part, at least they expressed a concern, and they did have some part in the release. But I must make it clear that many other forces worked to bring it about also. Senator Kennedy did take a specific step. He was in contact with officials in Georgia during my arrest, and he called my wife, made a personal call, and expressed his concern and said to her that he was working and trying to do something to make my release possible.
And that was Martin Luther King after he had been in prison, and President Kennedy and his brother, Senator Kennedy, Bob Kennedy, helped to get him out. So they came slow to the dance as well, but that really was kind of a turning point with their presidency, was it not?
Well, I think it absolutely was. And, the point is the government didn't necessarily do it. President Kennedy and his brother didn't necessarily do it. They sort of hopped on the bandwagon, literally, because, you've got images flashed across the nightly news of little kids being attacked by dogs and fire hoses and all of that stuff, and everybody was legitimately outraged and repulsed by what they were seeing. And so, yes, the president then had to act.
And the Bull Connors, spraying the fire hoses at people and all those kind of things. And you mentioned the dogs. We hadn't seen that before. And all of a sudden, that's across the screens of America. And then we have a young man named Mr. Merritt trying to get into University of Mississippi.
Yes.
And that really, and that became a riot-type situation. And the president held firm. Merritt held firm, and the governor eventually backed down. And so you talk about times where people showed courage in doing the right thing. There were those times.
There certainly were. You don't see those sorts of courageous acts anymore. I'm sure these things happen. The media certainly doesn't report them. Our president and our political leaders certainly don't demonstrate them on a regular basis. I can think of very few members of Congress who I would say are actually doing heroic work and showing true leadership, but, they get marginalized.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to get into more of what Martin Luther King Day is really all about and your thoughts about it. Bishop Counsel Nedd II with us here on the Morning News. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA, and we're talking about Martin Luther King Day right now and what it means to Bishop Counsel Nedd, our very special guest this morning. He said something, Bishop Nedd, that I thought was really amazing. He said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. I thought it was one of the great lines he's ever said. A lot of people never hear that one, but I think that could stand for all citizens out there, that you really have to work for freedom all the time, don't you?
You do. Growing up in Washington and having worked in Washington all the time, conservative staffers always talk about the hard work of freedom. We make jokes about it and, during the hard work of freedom. But the fact is you're absolutely right. It's a constant struggle. And you don't really get to rest. It's just that simple.
Right.
And Dr. King was right. Dr. King understood that. And it's lost in so many of his other great quotes, though. That's a shame.
Yes, it is. I was watching a movie last night, Men of Honor. And it was a movie, Cuba Gooding plays a part of a guy who, and it was a true story, who works his way up to be a master Navy diver.
Right.
And he meets with, I'm sure you've seen the movie, he meets with all kinds of racism along the way. He eventually, one of the guys who was most racist toward him, who is played by Robert De Niro in the movie, eventually helps him as he loses his leg in one of his diving things that he eventually makes it through to get to. And then he comes back, he wants to be reinstated.
Right.
And, Robert De Niro at the end, who was a racist in the beginning, goes in to try to help him at the end. And what bonded them together was honor. I've seen so many stories about people who have achieved. And somehow there's this feeling today that we all get dealt the same deck of cards. We all get dealt the same climate. We all get dealt the same place. And therefore we should all finish at the same place. That's just not true. We see courage like that all the time, don't we?
Well, we do. Nobody's dealt the same hand. No one ever said life is fair, and it's truly not fair. None of us are dealt the same hand, but we just have to make do with the hand we have and do the best we can. And it's just that simple. Dr. King understood that and gave his life for that concept of people at least need a good starting chance.
That was another of his great lines. He said, a man who won't die for something is not fit to live.
Right.
And obviously he spent his life and gave his life because of that. But you see so many examples of people out there who achieve in this country. Do you achieve because you stop thinking about race? Or do you achieve because you put race to the side and said, I'm not going to let that be an impediment to what I'm going to do. I've got my eyes set on something and I'm going to go there.
Well, yeah, that's a tough decision that, unfortunately a lot of people have to make. Either I'm going to overcome this or I'm going to let this be the reason why I fail in life, why I don't excel.
Yeah, it seems like it shouldn't be an excuse. I mean, we could all make excuses about anything. Yeah. Because, we want... Listen, I think we need to do everything in this country to make the ground as even to start as we humanly can. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to get to that point. But I realize that we will never totally get there. And so we don't guarantee outcomes. We guarantee the pursuit of happiness. And again, I think we can work harder to make sure that pursuit of happiness is going on in this country. But it seems to me that that's going to come through education. It's going to come through family. It's going to come through people supporting those kinds of things that help to make us more independent. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's precisely what it's going to take. You're absolutely right. Your listeners are blessed that they get to listen to you speak on a regular basis about these things that are so important. But, these fundamental beliefs that have made this country great, hard work, effort, diligence, getting a good education, they're all important. And now, because of the efforts of Dr. King, everybody has access to these things.
Bishop Nedd, final thought. I was talking to a friend this morning. He said, I don't talk about race much. There are a lot of people that are afraid to talk about race. White people particularly say, well, I don't want to say the right things and so forth. Whatever happened to just talking straight? You and I are having a good conversation this morning. I don't know how to talk about it any other way because I've never seen race as a factor in my relations with people. So how do we talk about that? What's the best advice you can give to people in this country?
People just need to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's not a bugaboo. People just need to talk and have normal conversations, stop worrying about political correctness, and just have open, honest conversations. I mean, that's how America got to the point where it is today, because people were having open, honest conversations about what was actually going on in the real world. And they addressed them head on, dealt with them, and here we are today in 2014, where everybody essentially has equality in the eyes of the law.
So the idea is let's try to be independent. Let's try to forget about all the obstacles in front of us and work forward. And hopefully, as brothers, we can do that all along the way.
You're absolutely right.
Bishop Nedd, it's been an honor having you aboard this morning. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being with us here on the Gary Sutton Show.
Thank you so much for having me on again. God bless you and your listeners.
We'll look forward to having you again soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bishop Counsel Nedd with us here on the Gary Sutton Show.